She wasn't looking for attention when she walked into the supply depot that morning. She wasn't there to remind anyone of who she used to be, or what she had endured, or the years that had carved lines into her face and scars into her body. She was there for something simple: a pair of boots that fit, a hydration pack that worked, and a handful of supplies she'd been asked to help distribute for a weekend exercise. That was it. Nothing more. But some mornings, the world has a way of turning the ordinary into something unforgettable. The sun had barely cleared the tree line at Fort Brenton, painting the motor pool in stripes of gold and shadow. The air was already thick, clinging to skin and uniforms alike. Soldiers jogged past in formation, cadence calls echoing in the heavy air, each voice joining another until it sounded like the pulse of the base itself. Engines coughed awake, diesel fumes mixing with the sharp tang of disinfectant from freshly scrubbed hallways. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like chaos. But for anyone who had worn the uniform long enough, it was rhythm, it was routine, it was the heartbeat of a machine that never truly stopped. Nobody noticed her at first. Just another civilian stepping out of an old pickup, shoulders square, hair tied back with regulation precision, though no regulation demanded it anymore. Her jacket was the first thing people saw when they did finally look. A faded green field jacket, its fabric frayed at the seams, its color bleached unevenly by years under desert suns and nights of rain that soaked through to the bone. It wasn't just worn, it was lived in. And draped across her shoulders, it looked like it belonged there more than the pressed uniforms of the lieutenants clustered near the boot racks inside. Her name was Marissa Calderon, though most people didn't bother to ask. 50 years old, gray threading through her dark hair, she carried herself with the posture of someone who'd once stood in formation for hours without moving. Her right leg bore the faintest hitch, the kind of limp you'd only see if you were trained to notice. It wasn't weakness. It was history. The echo of a blast on a road outside Fallujah that had changed the way she walked forever. Inside the depot, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting pale shadows across stacks of MRE boxes and rows of neatly folded uniforms. The air smelled of canvas, cardboard, and burnt coffee from a machine that seemed older than half the recruits waiting in line. She scanned her list: boots, hydration rig, gloves, tape. Simple. Ordinary. The kind of gear every soldier took for granted until it wasn't there. She moved with quiet efficiency, gathering what she needed, ignoring the chatter of the 3 young officers by the counter. Their uniforms were fresh, their brass still shining like it had been polished that morning. Their voices carried just enough to reach her ears, though not enough to claim responsibility. It was the art of mocking without ever admitting it. "Look at that jacket," one of them muttered, smirking as if he'd discovered something amusing. "Goodwill special," another chimed in, earning a ripple of laughter. "She probably found it in a closet and thought she'd play soldier for the day," said the third, his tone dripping with the kind of arrogance that only comes with rank untested by reality. Marissa kept her eyes on the clipboard, her movements steady. She didn't need their approval, and she certainly didn't need to defend herself. She'd learned long ago that some people couldn't see past what was in front of them. To them, a faded jacket was just fabric. To her, it was memory stitched into every fray, sacrifice woven into every loose thread. She reached the counter and handed over the authorization form she'd been given. The private behind the register looked barely old enough to shave, his hands fumbling with the scanner like it might bite him if pressed the wrong way. His name tag read Cooper. He cleared his throat nervously. System saying it needs active duty clearance, ma'am. I'm not authorized to process this without supervisor approval." Before she could reply, one of the lieutenants sauntered over. He had the kind of smile that wanted the world to know he was in charge, though nothing in his eyes suggested he had earned the right. He took the paper without asking, holding it up to the light like a detective looking for hidden ink. "Pretty good fake," he said casually. "But you'd be surprised how often we see this. People trying to play dress up. You can print just about anything with the right template online." The private shifted uneasily, caught between regulations and the rank standing next to him. Marissa said nothing. She simply gathered her list and stepped aside, settling onto a metal bench against the wall. The bench was cold, the kind that forced every nerve to notice it, but she didn't flinch. She'd waited in worse places, under worse circumstances. The officers laughed again, louder this time, emboldened by what they thought was an easy target. To them, it was just a morning distraction, something to fill the minutes before duty pulled them elsewhere. To her, it was nothing new. She'd seen the same kind of arrogance in young recruits overseas, laughter too loud, confidence too thin, eyes that hadn't yet seen what the world was capable of showing them. Then the air shifted. It wasn't sound at first, but presence. A silence that seemed to move faster than noise, stilling conversations and halting footsteps. The kind of silence that comes when authority enters a room not because it demands attention, but because it carries it like a shadow. He came in quietly, a man whose uniform bore more than just fabric. His sleeves were rolled, tattoos curling along his forearms like history carved into skin. His name tape was faded, his boots worn, but there was nothing casual about him. Brigadier General Alden Ross carried himself with the kind of weight that didn't need introduction. He moved toward the counter without looking at the officers, set down a tray of coffee with deliberate calm, and then turned. His eyes found Marissa on the bench. His steps slowed. The officers froze mid-laugh, their voices trailing off as they realized someone was listening, someone who mattered. Ross didn't ask for identification. He didn't ask for proof. His gaze went to her shoulder, to the ghostly outline of a patch that had long since faded from recognition. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. "That patch," he said, his voice steady but carrying enough force to silence the depot entirely. "Where did you serve with them?" The lieutenants blinked, confusion flickering across their faces. To them, it was just fabric. To Ross, it was something else. Something dangerous. Something sacred. Marissa straightened almost imperceptibly, her spine responding to a tone her body hadn't forgotten. She didn't look up, not right away. When she did, her eyes met his with calm steadiness. "Black Dune," she said quietly. And later, Iron Gate. The words meant nothing to the young officers. Just names, empty syllables strung together. But to Ross, they were coordinates etched into memory. Operations whispered in corridors, filed under titles that never saw the light of day. The depot was silent now. The kind of silence that came not from fear, but from the awareness that something important was happening. Something no one wanted to interrupt. General Ross didn't smile, didn't soften his words with ceremony or preamble. He studied Marissa the way a seasoned commander studies a battlefield, with precision, with weight, with recognition of things that aren't visible to the untrained eye. "Iron Gate," he repeated, his tone more reverent than questioning. "Most people don't even know that name exists." Marissa gave a small nod. "Most people aren't supposed to." The officers by the boot racks looked at one another, suddenly less sure of themselves. The smirks that had carried them only moments ago had vanished, replaced by a stiffness in their posture, as if standing straighter might erase the memory of what they had said. The private behind the counter stared at his monitor, cheeks flushed, trying to make himself invisible. Ross crouched slightly, setting the coffee tray on the edge of the bench beside her. He didn't lower his voice, but the weight in it made every syllable feel heavier. "You ran point during the southern corridor sweep, didn't you?" Her eyes flickered for the briefest moment, recognition, memory, the echo of things she hadn't spoken of in years. "We did what was necessary," she said evenly. "We got people out." The general's jaw tightened. He remembered. Everyone who had been there remembered. He straightened, his gaze sweeping the depot until it landed squarely on the lieutenants. They froze, hands behind their backs, eyes locked forward like cadets called out in front of a formation. "You think you know what a soldier looks like," Ross said, his voice sharp enough to slice through the silence. "You think it's about pressed uniforms and polished brass. But you don't have a clue. That jacket," he pointed at Marissa without breaking eye contact, "has seen more combat than any of you have read about in your training manuals." One of the lieutenants shifted uneasily. The general's eyes snapped toward him. Do you find this amusing, Lieutenant? No, sir, the young man stammered, the bravado gone. Good, Ross replied, his tone cutting off any chance of further reply. He turned back to Marissa, softer now. I didn't expect to see anyone from Iron Gate again. Thought most of you. He let the words trail off, the implication heavier than any explanation. Some of us made it out, Marissa said. Most of us didn't. The depot felt smaller somehow, as if the air itself had thickened with unspoken history. Soldiers passing through slowed their steps, sensing something they couldn't quite name. Even the forklifts in the back seemed to pause, engines idling without motion. Ross extended his hand, not like a superior, but like a comrade. Sergeant Calderon, you have my respect. And you have this depot's full cooperation. Whatever you need, it's yours. She hesitated, then accepted the handshake. It wasn't the grip of strangers meeting for the first time, it was the clasp of people bound by battles neither wanted to remember but both refused to forget. The sergeant major appeared from the back office, drawn by the shift in atmosphere. He took in the scene with the practiced eye of someone who'd walked into 1,000 tense moments and knew better than to speak before he understood. Ross didn't waste words. This woman is to be given immediate access to whatever equipment she requests. No forms, no waiting, no questions. That's a directive from me personally. Understood? Yes, sir, the sergeant major replied without hesitation. The private behind the counter scrambled to comply, scanning overrides with trembling hands. The system that had moments ago been an obstacle now seemed to bend under urgency. Boxes were pulled, boots fitted, hydration packs checked for leaks. Within minutes, a pile of gear sat neatly stacked beside Marissa, everything she had asked for and more. The general remained standing by her side, making sure no one mistook his intent. Authority wasn't in the words he spoke, it was in the way people moved faster, straighter, with sharper focus when he was in the room. The officers stayed silent, their earlier arrogance turned brittle under the weight of what they now understood, at least in part. They had mocked what they couldn't recognize, and now they stood exposed in their ignorance. Marissa gathered her supplies without rush, movements precise, steady, the kind of efficiency that never leaves someone who's lived through deployments. She looked at Ross once more, not with gratitude, she didn't need validation, but with acknowledgement. I wasn't here to prove anything, she said quietly. Just to help. And you did, Ross replied. His voice carried more than respect. It carried regret, memory, and something else, responsibility. He turned then, addressing the room. Every one of you standing here will remember this moment. You'll remember that respect is not about rank. It's not about the shine on your boots or the cut of your uniform. Respect is about sacrifice, about service, about scars you can't always see. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with the weight of his words, settling into the minds of everyone present. The young officers stared at the floor, the private nodded almost imperceptibly, and the sergeant major's expression hardened with something that looked a lot like pride. Marissa stepped toward the door, gear in hand, her jacket shifting just enough to reveal the faded trace of her patch again. A contractor passing by caught sight of it and froze mid-stride, his expression changing from indifference to recognition. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply stepped aside, giving her a clear path. Outside, the sun had risen higher, the heat pressing down with unrelenting force. She walked steadily, boots crunching gravel, each step carrying the quiet dignity of someone who had nothing left to prove. The depot behind her resumed its rhythm, but the tone was different now. Laughter had been replaced by silence, routine replaced by reflection. Ross followed her to the door but stopped short of stepping outside. He watched her go, hands clasped behind his back, eyes narrowed against the glare. He knew the stories that would ripple through the base before sundown. He knew the whispers that would spread in chow halls and barracks. And he knew that somewhere along the way, those whispers would carry more truth than most official reports ever had. The lieutenants remained where they stood, chastened but not dismissed. They would carry the memory of that morning longer than they carried their shiny rank. Ross didn't need to punish them further, the weight of their own shame would do more than any reprimand could. Marissa reached her truck, sliding the gear into the backseat with practiced ease. She didn't glance back at the depot. She didn't need to. The point had been made, not by her words but by her silence, not by her posture but by her presence. And as the engine rumbled to life, she allowed herself a rare exhale, a breath that felt heavier going out than it had coming in. For the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't expected to find in a supply depot on a Monday morning: recognition, unspoken but undeniable. The wheels crunched over gravel, dust rising in the hot morning air, carrying her away from the depot, from the whispers, from the young men who had mistaken arrogance for authority. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even bitter. She was simply steady, carrying herself into the day like she always had, quietly, resiliently, with the kind of strength that doesn't need applause to exist. The highway leading out of Fort Brenton shimmered with heat as Marissa's truck rolled forward, its engine humming a steady rhythm that matched her heartbeat. She had driven these roads before, years ago, when her life had been ruled by deployments and orders instead of contractor jobs and quiet volunteer work. Back then, every mile carried the weight of preparation, packing, training, steeling yourself for what came next. Now, the drive carried something else. Reflection. She adjusted the rearview mirror. Behind her, the bay shrank into distance, a cluster of beige buildings swallowed by pine trees and haze. But even as it faded from sight, the morning's events refused to fade from memory. She could still hear the lieutenant's laughter, sharp and careless. She could still feel the chill of the depot's bench against her spine, the weight of every glance that had dismissed her. And she could still hear the one word from General Ross that had silenced them all: respect. Not spoken aloud, but present in every tone, every look, every action he had taken on her behalf. The road stretched ahead, long and open. She let her thoughts travel it freely, unspooling years of memory she usually kept tucked away. The jacket on her shoulders was more than cloth, it was a ledger. Every faded thread marked by nights on patrol, every scar in the fabric etched by moments that never made it into official reports. She remembered Black Dune, the endless sand, the suffocating silence before contact, the way the horizon seemed to swallow sound until it exploded with chaos. She remembered Iron Gate, the relentless push through a valley no one wanted to enter, the echo of mortar fire bouncing between stone walls, the faces of people she couldn't save, and the ones she did. She never told those stories at bars or family gatherings. They weren't for entertainment. They were pieces of her, heavy and sharp, carried quietly. To the lieutenants, her jacket had been a costume. To her, it was memory made tangible. That was the difference between playing soldier and being one: you didn't need to tell anyone who you were. The truth was stitched into you, whether people believed it or not. At a stoplight, she glanced at the glove compartment. Inside was a letter she hadn't opened yet, forwarded from an old colleague who still worked rotations overseas. A consulting job, temporary but well-paid, supporting logistics for an Allied training mission. She'd left it sealed for weeks, telling herself she didn't need to go back, didn't need to prove anything. But after that morning, she wondered if maybe it wasn't about proving at all. Maybe it was about reminding herself that experience mattered. That scars weren't just remnants of pain, but evidence of survival. The light turned green. She pressed the accelerator, feeling the truck surge ahead, the tires gripping asphalt baked by the southern sun. She thought about Ross, his steady gaze, the way his presence filled the depot without needing to raise his voice. He hadn't swooped in as a savior. He hadn't needed to. He had simply recognized what others had missed. And in that recognition, he had restored something she hadn't realized she'd been missing: validation. She hadn't come to Fort Brenton seeking it. She had come to help, to keep her hands busy, to feel useful while waiting for the next contract. But dignity has a way of surfacing when you least expect it. That single moment, his acknowledgement of her past, his public affirmation, had shifted the day, shifted her. The lieutenants would remember it as a lesson in humility. She would remember it as proof that ghosts still left shadows, even when the world tried to erase them. The highway bent south, winding past fields where the grass swayed in waves against the breeze. Marissa rolled down her window, letting the hot air wash through the cab, carrying with it the scent of pine and dust. She felt the pull of fatigue in her leg, the dull ache that came with weather and years. It reminded her that she was no longer 20, no longer invincible. But it also reminded her she was still here. Still standing. Still moving forward when so many had been left behind. She thought about the lieutenants again, their laughter now hollow in memory. She didn't hate them. She didn't even resent them. They were young, arrogant, untested. She had once seen versions of herself in soldiers like that, before the first ambush, before the first loss, before the first time reality carved away illusion. They would learn, just as she had learned, that respect wasn't something you demanded. It was something you carried. Something you earned when no one was watching. Something that stayed long after medals tarnished and ribbons collected dust. Her phone buzzed on the seat beside her, vibrating against the metal buckle. She ignored it. Whoever it was could wait. For once, she didn't feel rushed. She didn't feel invisible. She felt grounded, as if the weight of her past had settled into something she could carry without strain. As the miles passed, a quiet certainty grew inside her. She wasn't finished yet. Not with service, not with purpose. Maybe her role had changed, maybe the battles were different now, but the principle remained. She still had something to give. And the world still needed people who had been there, who had endured, who understood that strength isn't loud, it's steady. By the time she pulled into her driveway, the sun was high, casting hard shadows across the yard. She killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the tick of cooling metal, the echo of cadence calls still faint in her memory. She lifted the gear from the passenger seat and shouldered the weight, lighter than the pack she'd once carried, heavier than anything the lieutenants could yet imagine. Inside her apartment, she set the boots by the door, the hydration pack on the counter, the gloves neatly folded beside them. She hung the jacket on the back of a chair, its fabric catching the light. Faded, tattered, imperfect, and truer than anything else in the room. She lowered herself into a chair, opened the glove compartment letter, and read. Consulting work. Interference operations support. A chance to shape the next generation, not with lectures, not with theories, but with lived experience. She read it twice, then set it down, her fingers tracing the edge of the page. Outside, a neighbor's child pedaled past on a bike, the sound of laughter ringing through the quiet street. Marissa watched for a moment, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Life kept moving, and so would she. She leaned back, closed her eyes, and let the morning replay once more. The bench. The laughter. The silence. The general's question. And her answer, simple and unadorned, spoken without pride or shame, Black Dune. Iron Gate. 2 words for places most people would never know. 2 words that carried a lifetime. 2 words that had reminded her she was more than a relic, more than a faded jacket, more than the whispers of youth too young to understand. She opened her eyes again, sharper now, as if the world had refocused. Tomorrow would come. With it, choices. And maybe, just maybe, another chapter still worth writing.